5 years. 5 years she stood in the shadows of a man who built his empire on fear, and she let him because she loved him. On the night of their anniversary, Roman Devereaux whispered 3 words that ended everything. Stay in your place. She smiled, she nodded, and then, in front of 500 witnesses, she slid her wedding ring off her finger, set it on the table like a punctuation mark, and walked out of his world forever. Roman let her go. By morning, $3 billion alliances were suspended, and the most feared man in Chicago finally understood he hadn't lost a wife. He had lost the only reason his empire was still standing. If you've ever been told to stay in your place, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels.
Thoughts at 9.
The ballroom of the Aldermere Grand had not changed in 40 years. Same vaulted ceilings with their gold leaf molding gone slightly brown at the edges. Same crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across the faces of people who had learned, long ago, how to smile without meaning it. Same orchestral quartet tucked into the far corner, playing music that nobody listened to but everyone required. Roman Devereaux had rented the entire venue for the evening. 3 floors, private security at every stairwell, 24 of his own men positioned throughout the crowd in suits that didn't quite fit their shoulders. He had paid for the flowers, the champagne, the catering company whose owner owed him a significant favor. He had paid for everything. He always paid for everything. That was the point. Roman stood near the center of the main floor, one hand loose around a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, the other resting in the pocket of his jacket. He was 43 years old, and he looked every year of it tonight. Not in a diminished way, but in the way of a man who had been tested constantly and had not yet broken. His jaw was angular and set, his dark hair silver at the temples, his posture the particular kind of stillness that made rooms unconsciously rearrange themselves around him. People had a habit of clearing space for Roman Devereaux without being told to. He was listening to Carmine Falsetti describe a port negotiation in Galveston while also tracking, with the peripheral precision of a man trained to account for every variable, the positions of 7 different people across the room, his underboss Marcus Wren near the bar, his consigliere Vincent Holloway at the far table with the city councilman, the 2 representatives from the Okoye family from Detroit who had come to Chicago with money and grudges in equal measure, the Castellano brothers from New Orleans who were circling the appetizer tables and pretending they weren't casing the room, and across the ballroom, near the entrance to the corridor that led toward the kitchen, Diane Solari, 31, auburn hair, wearing a blue dress that Roman had not selected and had not been asked to approve. She was the daughter of one of his political brokers. She had been invited because her father insisted and because Roman had calculated that her presence would serve a purpose that had nothing to do with her personally. He was halfway through a response to Falsetti when he saw Evelyn. She came through the main doors without announcement. His staff had known better than to announce her because Roman had not placed her on any official guest list for the evening. She was wearing ivory, a fitted dress with a high collar and long sleeves, her dark hair pulled back from her face with the kind of severe elegance that required no jewelry to complete it. She was 38 years old, and she moved the way she always moved, with a measured, unhurried quality that Roman had once found calming and had more recently found inconvenient. He watched her scan the room. It took her approximately 4 seconds. She found him. He looked away first, back toward Falsetti, and finished his sentence about the Galveston arrangement with the same flat precision he would have used if she hadn't appeared at all. His heartbeat had not changed. That was something he had spent 20 years perfecting. The complete removal of readable reaction from his body. No one looking at him would have known anything. Evelyn crossed the ballroom slowly. She didn't cut through the crowd. She moved along the edges, nodding twice to people who recognized her, pausing once to exchange a few words with a woman near the bar that Roman didn't recognize from that distance. She was not hurrying. She was not performing. She simply moved through the room with the settled confidence of someone who had been in 100 rooms like this and had made peace with all of them. Roman excused himself from Falsetti with a hand on the man's shoulder and 3 words. He made his way through 2 clusters of conversation, accepted a brief greeting from one of the city councilmen, and positioned himself near the long table where the night's primary guests were seated before Evelyn could reach it. She arrived at his side 60 seconds later. "Roman," Her voice was neutral. You weren't on the list for tonight. His wasn't. I'm your wife. She said it without inflection. Not angry, not wounded. Simply a statement of accurate fact, the way one might cite a legal document. I was under the impression that the anniversary of our marriage was an occasion I was permitted to attend. He didn't answer that directly. He lowered his voice and angled his body so that the nearest guests, Falchetti, who had followed at a respectful distance, and the older Castellano brother, would see a man speaking privately to a woman and think nothing of it. Stay in your place tonight, he said. She looked at him. The words hung in the few inches of air between them. She had heard him clearly. The ballroom was loud enough that no one else had, but his diction was precise and his intention was unmistakable. Stay in your place. Tonight. When the cameras were on him, when the right people were watching, when the careful architecture of his public image required certain adjacencies and prohibited others, Evelyn did not flinch. Her face rearranged itself into the expression he had seen 1,000 times. Quiet, composed, the smooth social surface she had learned to maintain in rooms full of men who would have preferred she didn't exist. She nodded once, very slightly. Her eyes held his for a moment that was neither challenging nor submissive, just flat and watchful and very, very still. Of course, she said. Roman turned back toward the table. He pulled out a chair and gestured toward it. Not for Evelyn, but for Diane Solari, who had materialized at his elbow in the way that people with social antennae tend to do when they've been given certain signals. Diane sat down with a smile that she deployed like a weapon, and a glance at Evelyn that lasted a fraction of a second too long. Roman did not watch Evelyn walk away. He didn't need to. He had already filed the interaction and moved on to the next calculation. There were 12 important conversations to be had tonight, 3 of which needed to happen before 9 o'clock, and his attention was not an unlimited resource. Evelyn stood at the far edge of the table and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. She drank half of it in a single composed swallow. Her expression didn't change. She had driven 90 minutes from the house in Winnetka alone, in her own car, at Roman's request not to use the organization's drivers this evening. She had dressed in front of a mirror in a room that still had both their names on the mortgage but had long since stopped feeling like a shared space. She had done her own hair, and she had chosen the ivory dress because ivory was the color she'd worn the night they met 15 years ago, in a room that had smelled like cigarette smoke and expensive cologne, when Roman Devereaux was 28 years old and still had something like warmth somewhere behind his eyes. She set the champagne flute down on the linen tablecloth. Beneath the table, hidden by the drape of ivory fabric, she reached for the ring on her left hand. It was white gold, 3 carats. He had chosen it himself, had put it on her finger in a courthouse ceremony that his organization had required to be quiet and had arranged to be brief. She had not minded at the time. She had thought she understood the world he moved in and had accepted its terms. The ring was slightly loose. It had been slightly loose for about 2 years, which meant her hands had gotten thinner, which meant she hadn't been eating properly, which meant a string of small, slow deteriorations she had stopped tracking because tracking them required acknowledging them. She worked it off slowly. It took longer than it should have. Her knuckle caught. She didn't rush. When it came free, she held it in her palm for exactly the time it took her to breathe in and breathe out once. Then she set it on the tablecloth beside the half-empty champagne flute. It made a very small, clean sound. No one at the table heard it. The orchestra was playing something with strings. Evelyn Ashcombe straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, and walked toward the main doors. She did not look back at Roman. She didn't need to. She already knew his posture by heart, the set of his jaw, the angle of his shoulders, the way he would be managing 6 things simultaneously without appearing to manage anything at all. She had watched him work a room for 15 years. She could reconstruct the scene behind her with her eyes closed. What she could not reconstruct, and had stopped trying to reconstruct, was the version of him that had once said her name like it was something valuable. The night air hit her face the moment the lobby doors opened. Late October in Chicago. Dense cold, a wet smell off the lake 6 blocks east, the ambient noise of city traffic beyond the Aldermere's private entrance. She had parked her car 2 blocks north in a structure where the attendant wouldn't know whose wife she was. She had done that deliberately, 4 hours ago, in the forward-thinking way she did most things. She walked those 2 blocks without stopping. She did not call anyone. She did not send a message. She got into her car, started the engine, and sat in the parking structure for approximately 40 seconds with her hands on the wheel and the heat coming on. Then she drove south, then west, and did not turn toward Winnetka. Inside the Aldermere Grand, the evening continued without interruption. Roman was at the head of the primary table by 9:15, seated between Vincent Holloway and the older Falchetti, with Diane Solari 2 chairs to his right, and both Castellano brothers within easy conversation range. The Okoye representatives had moved closer during the last half hour, which meant the evening was progressing according to the social mechanics Roman had planned. Vincent Holloway was 61 years old with a full head of white hair and the careful, deliberate manner of a man who had spent 40 years learning how to be trusted. He had been Roman's consigliere for 12 of those years, had served Roman's father before that, and had a quality of patient attention that made people feel genuinely heard. Roman valued this. He valued Vincent's judgment on personnel, his instincts in negotiation, his memory for the kind of granular detail that tended to matter at the wrong moment. "Your wife left early," Vincent said. His voice was quiet, calibrated for Roman's ear only. "I noticed," Roman said. "She looked well." "Vincent." A pause. Vincent understood the boundary and adjusted accordingly. "Falchetti wants the conversation about the offshore arrangement moved to tomorrow morning. His lawyers are here tonight, but apparently they prefer breakfast." "Fine." Roman cut a piece of the beef that had been set in front of him and didn't eat it. 7:30. "Tell them to come without the lawyers. I want the initial conversation to be clean." Vincent nodded and reached for his own wine. Roman ate very little over the following hour. He spoke to everyone he needed to speak to, remembered the right details about the right people's children and businesses and recent difficulties, kept his scotch glass at a consistent level of mostly full without drinking from it, and presented himself with the particular variety of controlled warmth that had taken him the better part of a decade to calibrate correctly. Not cold. Cold made people nervous, and nervousness made them unpredictable. Not friendly. Friendly suggested weakness. The precise median, maintained through the entire evening, like a frequency held constant through interference. By 11:30, the event was winding down on its scheduled timeline. Roman shook 40 hands. He said the right things. He watched his people do the quiet maintenance work of moving guests toward exits without anyone feeling ushered. It was Marcus Wren who found him at 11:50, in the brief window between the last departing guests and the cleanup crews. Marcus was 35 and had been with the organization for 9 years. He was a careful man, not especially warm but consistently reliable, which Roman valued above warmth without question. He had a way of delivering information with a flat economy that Roman appreciated. No editorializing, no padding, no visible opinion about the content of what he was saying. Tonight, however, Marcus's face had something in it that Roman did not immediately catalog. "3 things," Marcus said. Roman waited. "The Delacroix family suspended their joint arrangement with us effective midnight tonight. No explanation offered. Their representative says the decision came from Philippe himself." Roman's jaw tightened by a fraction. The Delacroix family controlled significant real estate infrastructure in Louisiana and Mississippi, and their arrangement with the Devereaux organization had been in place for 6 years. Philippe Delacroix was not a reactive man. "When did we receive that?" The message came in at 11:07. "An hour ago." Roman had been shaking hands. "What else?" "The Cho Collective out of Vancouver has placed a hold on the transit contracts. Pending internal review, their communication says. No timeline given. Silence." Roman looked at the empty ballroom, servers moving between tables, the orchestra packing its equipment, the last of the flower arrangements being cleared. The Vancouver contracts were newer, less than 18 months, but they represented a routing arrangement that affected 7 downstream operations. A hold was not a termination, but holds had a way of becoming terminations when no one came back to the table to renegotiate. "And the third," Roman said. "The Okoye family sent a message 40 minutes ago. They're withdrawing from tomorrow's scheduled meeting with the Devereaux organization. They did not specify a reason or offer a reschedule." Marcus paused. All 3 communications came in within the same 2-hour window. Roman said nothing for a long moment. The 3 families had nothing obvious in common. Different regions, different business structures, different histories with the Devereaux organization. There was no coalition logic to the timing. There was no shared provocation he could identify from the evening's events. There was only the timing itself. 2-hour window. He thought about Evelyn's car pulling away from a parking structure 2 blocks north at some point during that window. "Get me her location," he said. Marcus's expression did not change. "Her phone is off. Her car has a tracker. It was disabled. The signal dropped at 10:47 near the interchange at I-90 and I-94. Roman stood very still. Outside, through the tall windows of the Aldermere Grand, Chicago spread itself in all directions, the lake invisible in the dark, the grid of streets lit orange and white, the distant sound of traffic continuous as breath. He had built something in this city that very few men had ever built, and he had built it on the foundation of his ability to see every variable before it moved. He had not seen this one. He had not seen her. He turned toward the table closest to him. There, sitting on the white linen beside an empty champagne flute, was a white gold ring. Small. 3 carats, slightly loose on the finger that had worn it. He picked it up. It was lighter than he expected, which made no sense. It was the same ring. It had always weighed the same amount. Nothing about it had changed. But it sat in his palm with a lightness that felt entirely wrong, like holding a key to a lock that no longer existed. Marcus waited. "She left her ring," Roman said. Marcus said nothing. "She planned this." He was not asking. He was reconstructing, running the architecture of it backward, event by event, and finding, with the particular nauseating clarity of a man whose professional instinct is pattern recognition, that this was not impulse. This was not anger. This was not the reactive departure of a woman humiliated in public, though the humiliation had been real and he had delivered it deliberately. This was a design. Stay in your place. She had already decided before she heard those words. The words had been a door she walked through that she had already located and already measured. 3 families suspended within the same window, without explanation. "Who did she speak to at the bar tonight?" Roman asked. Marcus said, "We're pulling the security footage now." And the woman near the entrance, ivory dress, dark hair, who approached the Okoye representatives around 9 o'clock. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, very slight. "That was her, sir." Roman looked up from the ring. "She spoke with the Okoye representatives for approximately 6 minutes before they moved toward the bar. We didn't flag it at the time. 6 minutes. She had spoken with the representatives of one of the 3 families that had just suspended operations with his organization for 6 minutes in the same room where he had told her to stay in her place. He had been watching 6 other things. He had filed the interaction and moved on. He closed his fingers around the ring. "Find her," he said. His voice was very quiet. Not with threat. With something more unsettling than threat. With the tone of a man who has just opened a drawer he has kept locked for years and found it empty in a way that suggested it had never contained what he thought it contained. Marcus was already moving toward the door when Roman said, without turning, "And Marcus." The man stopped. "Don't treat this like a missing person." Roman finally looked down at the ring again, turning it slowly between 2 fingers. "Treat it like reconnaissance." Marcus left. Roman stood alone in the gutted ballroom of the Aldermere Grand with a white gold ring and the beginning of a reckoning. While outside the windows, his city continued on its axis, indifferent, lit orange and white against the October dark, carrying with it the particular momentum of a world that had not yet stopped to inform him of how completely the ground beneath his empire had already shifted. He did not know yet that when he found her trail, and he would find her trail, because that was the one capacity he had never doubted in himself, he would not be reconstructing a departure. He would be reconstructing a life. The first 48 hours were quiet in the way that a pressure cooker is quiet. Everything contained, everything building, the silence itself a form of violence waiting for release. Roman did not sleep on the night of the anniversary. He returned to the house in Winnetka at midnight and stood in the front hallway for a long moment without removing his coat. The house was the kind of large that announces itself. 12 rooms, hardwood floors, a kitchen that had been renovated twice in 5 years, because Evelyn had a precise idea of how a kitchen should function, and Roman had paid for that precision without ever once eating a meal inside it that hadn't been catered. The lights were on timers. The plants were alive, right? She had maintained them herself, he noticed now, because he could not remember ever seeing a service come to tend them. He walked through the ground floor slowly, into the kitchen, into the sitting room off the back, into the small office that Evelyn had used and that he had never once entered without knocking, a habit so ingrained he almost knocked now before he pushed the door open and went inside. The desk was clean. That was the first thing. Not clean in the way of a desk that has been recently tidied, clean in the way of a surface that has been deliberately cleared. The surface held nothing. No papers, no folders, no correspondence, no the residue of any ongoing work. The drawers were unlocked. She had left them that way deliberately, he understood, so he would know to look inside them. He pulled them open one by one, pens, a stapler, a box of paper clips, the physical infrastructure of a workspace with all its content removed. He stood in her office for 4 minutes. Then he went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed they shared in the technical sense. Same room, separate territories, the geography of a marriage that had become a cohabitation arrangement with very clear unspoken borders, and looked at his hands. The ring was in his right jacket pocket. He had put it there in the ballroom and hadn't moved it. He did not take it out. At 3 a.m, Marcus Wren called. Her car was found at O'Hare long-term lot, level 4. She left it there. A pause. She paid cash for the parking ticket. Camera at the lot entrance caught the plate at 11:22. She flew out. We're working on the manifest. She didn't travel under her married name. Roman absorbed this. Her maiden name. Ashcombe. We're checking. She would have had identification ready. This was planned at least several weeks in advance. He said this without inflection, stating it, not performing surprise at it. He had already accepted the architecture of what she had done. What he was still processing was the depth of the preparation required to execute it. Check for a passport renewal in the last 6 months, under Ashcombe. Already flagged. We should have confirmation by morning. And the 3 families. Marcus was quiet for a moment. No further communication from any of them. Delacroix, Cho, Okoye. All 3 have gone dark. They're not panicking, Roman said. They're waiting. For what? I don't know yet. He pulled off his jacket and set it over the back of the chair near the window. Get me the complete communications log between the organization and all 3 families going back 18 months. Every contact, every intermediary, every occasion where the negotiation required a third-party presence to stabilize. Another pause, longer this time. That's a significant pull. I know what it is. Have it ready by 6. He ended the call and sat in the dark bedroom until the first gray light began to accumulate at the window. Not sleeping, not quite thinking. Running the architecture of his own empire through his memory, like a man who has been handed a map and told that the legend is wrong. By the second day, the communications log was on his desk. Roman worked through it for 6 hours without leaving the study. He read every entry in sequence, flagged items with a pen, went back and reread sections he'd initially passed over. He did not have coffee. He did not eat. His assistant brought both at intervals and removed them untouched. The pattern emerged slowly, the way patterns always do, not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of small, consistent details that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. March of the previous year, the Delacroix negotiation over Mississippi corridor access had stalled for 3 weeks before abruptly resolving. Roman remembered this as a success of patience on his part. He had waited them out. The log showed something different. There had been a 2-hour gap in communications on the 14th of March, a window during which neither party's official representatives were in contact. The negotiation had resumed the following morning with a revised framework that both parties accepted inside 40 minutes. 2-hour gap. Revised framework. Resolution. He found the same structure in the Cho collective arrangement, an 8-day deadlock in the transit contract negotiations that had ended with an agreement Roman had attributed to the Cho representatives' eventual reasonableness. The log showed the deadlock had been preceded by an unscheduled communication between the Cho representative and a party identified in the log only by the initials E.D. E.D. Evelyn Devereaux. Roman put his pen down on the desk. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for approximately 30 seconds. Then he picked the pen back up and continued reading. He needed the full scope before he let himself react. Reaction without complete information was the thing that had destroyed better men than him. The Okoye arrangement, 3 incidents in 14 months, each time a dispute that had threatened to escalate beyond negotiation, each time a resolution that Roman had categorized as the result of his own organization's leverage. The log showed, in each case, a short window of what was logged as informal contact, Devereaux household, which was the language his communication staff used when they couldn't categorize a contact through official channels. Informal contact, Devereaux household, her. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Roman had covered 14 months of logs and found her fingerprints, not metaphorically, but functionally, in the specific texture of interventions that shared her method. Patient, precise, conducted in the gaps between formal negotiations, always without attribution, always resolving what had been irresolvable. He called Marcus. I need to know who else she was in contact with. His voice was controlled. Not just the 3 families. Anyone who ran a negotiation through this organization over the past 3 years. I want to know if she was present, formally or otherwise. Marcus was quiet for 2 full seconds. Roman. Say it. How deep do you think this goes? I don't have a number yet. That's what I'm asking you to help me find. A pause. And I want to speak with Holloway tonight, 7 o'clock here. Bucky. Vincent Holloway arrived at 7:05, which was the first thing Roman noted. Vincent was never 5 minutes late. He was either precisely on time or calculated 10 minutes early when he wanted to signal deference. 5 minutes late was an anomaly. Small, possibly meaningless. Roman cataloged it. They sat in the study, Roman behind the desk, Vincent in the chair across from it, a glass of water in front of each of them. No scotch tonight. Roman had made that choice deliberately, and Vincent would know what it meant. You've been reading the communications logs, Vincent said. He said it pleasantly, without accusation, the way you might observe that someone has been looking at your photograph. Since 6 this morning. And? Tell me about the Delacroix Gap, March 14th. Vincent's expression remained arranged in the careful, unhurried configuration of a man who has nothing to conceal. The 14th, that was the Baton Rouge corridor dispute. We were negotiating access rights. I know what we were negotiating. I'm asking about the 2-hour gap in the log and what resolved it. A beat. Negotiations sometimes have informal components. I'm sure you're aware. Vincent. Roman's voice didn't rise. It dropped. Don't manage me. The room was quiet. Vincent set his water glass down with a small, deliberate motion. He was 61 years old, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have sat across from dangerous people many times and learned not to let their bodies betray their calculations. Evelyn made contact with the Delacroix representative during that window, Vincent said. I know. She approached me first. She had a proposed framework. She'd been developing it for several weeks. She asked me whether she should bring it to you directly. A pause. I told her not to. The air in the study changed in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. You told her not to bring it to me, Roman said. You were in the middle of a leverage play. You'd committed to a position and you were holding it. Her framework required your position to shift, which would have signaled, what you're telling me, Roman said, is that my consigliere authorized my wife to conduct a private negotiation on behalf of this organization without my knowledge. I'm telling you, she saved a 6-figure arrangement from collapsing. That's not what I asked. Vincent met his eyes. I made a judgment call. And the Cho Collective. Similar situation. The Okoye arrangement. Roman. How many times, Vincent? Vincent was quiet for a moment. The quality of his stillness had changed. It was the same absence of visible movement, the same careful arrangement of expression. But there was something different in the weight of it, a density, like a room where the pressure has shifted without the source being visible. 11 times, Vincent said, over 3 years. 11 interventions where she identified a problem, developed a resolution, and executed without disrupting your position or your public posture. 11 times. Roman looked at the desk in front of him, at the communications log spread across the surface, at the pen he'd been using to flag entries, at the glass of water he hadn't touched. He was very still in the way he had been still his entire adult life. The practiced stillness of a man who had trained his body to not announce his interior to anyone who was watching. "Who knew?" he said. "Within the organization? Myself and Marcus." Marcus knew. He became aware approximately 8 months in. He came to me and I explained the framework. He agreed it was the correct approach. Vincent paused. "He also told me it wouldn't hold indefinitely, that you'd find out eventually. And you decided when was the right time for me to find out." "I decided that the right time was not during any active negotiation." Roman stood up. Roman just said. He didn't do it with drama. He simply rose from his chair the way he would have at the end of any meeting, unhurried, deliberate. He moved to the window and stood with his back to Vincent, looking at the dark November lawn, the tree line at the property edge, the ambient light from the neighbor's house 200 meters away through the trees. "I want you to understand something," Roman said. His voice was extremely quiet. "I'm going to need you to reconstruct every one of those 11 interventions in writing. Every contact she made, every communication, every framework she proposed. Complete documentation. I can have that prepared. You'll have it to me by Monday morning." A pause. "And Vincent." "Yes. When you spoke to her, when she came to you with her frameworks and her proposed approaches, what was her tone?" He said it without the inflection of a question. Vincent considered this. She was professional, precise. She knew exactly what she wanted to accomplish. "Did she ever ask you to tell me?" A longer pause. "She asked. Once, in the second year." Vincent's voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but with a quality of truth in it that the earlier part of the conversation had not contained. "She said she thought you should know she was involved. She thought it might change how you—" He stopped. "How I what?" "How you saw her." Roman's hands were in his pockets. His fingers found the ring. He closed them around it without taking it out. "Leave," he said. Vincent stood, gathered himself in the way of a man who knows better than to say anything further, and left the study. Roman listened to his footsteps down the hall and the sound of the front door. He stood at the window for a long time after that. Santa Fe arrived in Roman's intelligence by the end of the third day, a property rental under the name E. Ashcombe in a residential neighborhood east of the plaza, confirmed by a contact who knew someone who knew the property manager. She had not hidden well, Roman thought at first, and then reconsidered. She had hidden precisely well enough. Not from Roman specifically. She knew he would find her, had probably calculated the timeline, knew his methods. She had hidden from the version of him who might arrive with operatives and ultimatums. She had made herself findable enough that his first instinct would be to come himself. She had accounted for even this. He did not go immediately. Instead, he spent 4 days making calls. Not about Evelyn, but about the specific texture of her work. He called Philippe Delacroix directly, which was not a thing Roman did casually, and told him plainly that he was conducting an internal review and that he would appreciate Philippe's honest assessment of their negotiation history. There was a pause on the line that told Roman something before Philippe said a single word. "She is a remarkable woman," Philippe Delacroix said finally. His voice carried the particular warmth of a man speaking about someone he genuinely respects. "Tell me what she did," Roman said. What Felipe described took 11 minutes. He described a conversation in which Evelyn had identified the single point of emotional friction underlying 3 months of failed negotiation, a slight Roman had delivered unintentionally 2 years prior that Philippe had never raised and had never stopped resenting. She had named it. She had named it directly and with no apology on Roman's behalf and no demand that Felipe release it, but simply by naming it she had cleared enough air for the actual negotiation to breathe. "She told me she had no official standing in the matter," Philippe said. "She said she was speaking as a private individual who happened to understand both parties." A pause. "I asked her why she was doing it. She said because the alternative was violence, and she found violence wasteful." Roman thanked him and ended the call. He sat for a long time afterward. He called the Cho representative the following morning. And then, after an interval of several hours during which he drove twice around the perimeter of the property in Winnetka without going inside, he called Margaret Okoye herself. Every conversation followed the same shape. Every person described the same woman, precise, direct, without performance. Motivated by something they found genuinely difficult to categorize because it didn't correspond to any motive they were accustomed to assigning to people in their world. She wanted the peace, Margaret Okoye said simply. Not the credit, not the position. She just wanted the thing to stop before someone got hurt. A pause. Does she know you're calling? No. I see. Margaret's voice had a quality Roman recognized as judgment, held with the experience of someone who knew when to deploy it and when to hold it. Mr. Devereaux, may I be direct? Please. In my family's 30 years of interaction with your organization, I have sat across the table from your father and from you, and I have respected both of you in the way that one respects force. What I felt for Evelyn was different. I trusted her. Roman said nothing. That kind of trust is not transferable, Margaret said. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He understood. He booked a flight to Albuquerque that evening. He did not bring Marcus. He did not bring anyone. He put a single bag in the overhead compartment and sat in the window seat of a commercial flight for the first time in 6 years and watched the black grid of Chicago recede below the clouds. He arrived in Santa Fe in the late afternoon and drove a rental car through streets that were nothing like Chicago. The sky too large, the buildings too low, the light coming in at angles he didn't recognize. He found the street, found the property, parked half a block away and sat in the car for a moment. The house was small by any standard he was accustomed to. Adobe construction, a wooden gate leading to a courtyard, a light on inside that threw a warm rectangle across the front window. The garden was already in better shape than it had any right to be after a short rental period, which meant she had been outside with her hands in the dirt, which meant she was settling, which meant this was not temporary housing to her. This was already somewhere she was building. He got out of the car. He walked to the gate and stopped. Through the front window, across the courtyard, and through the glass, he could see her at a desk. She was reading something, her head slightly bent, her dark hair loose in a way he almost didn't recognize because she kept it pinned in Chicago, always, even at home. She had a mug of something near her right hand. She was wearing a cardigan he'd never seen. She looked like someone he didn't know. She also looked like someone who was not waiting for rescue, not waiting for anything at all, which was its own category of information. He pushed open the gate. She heard it. He'd expected that. She was not a woman who existed without situational awareness, and he saw her posture change at the desk before she turned. When she turned, her face went through something fast and complicated and then settled into stillness. She stood up. Roman came through the courtyard and stopped outside the glass door. Through it, they looked at each other, 5 feet of glass and courtyard between them. She crossed the room and opened the door. She didn't open it wide. She held it with one hand, her body in the frame, and looked at him with the flat, watchful expression he had last seen across a crowded ballroom 2 weeks ago. Roman, she said. Evelyn. A moment. You have about 30 seconds before I close this door, she said. Use them. He looked at her, the cardigan, the loose hair, the mug on the desk behind her, and the paper spread around it and the small space that already looked like somewhere she belonged. And he said the only true thing he had brought with him. I didn't know what you were doing. Her expression did not soften. I know. 11 times, 3 years. I didn't know. I know you didn't know. Her voice was very level. That was the problem, Roman. Not that you didn't know, that you never looked. He had no answer for that. He had prepared a dozen things to say on the flight down and in the car, and standing half a block away, and none of them were adequate to this particular sentence delivered in this particular tone, which was not angry, not wounded, but simply accurate in the way of a diagnosis delivered without cruelty. 3 families suspended operations, he said. Yes. Did you tell them to? No. She held the door and looked at him. I told them the truth, that I was leaving. They made their own decisions. A pause. Those are relationships I built. They weren't transferable. That's not leverage. It's just the nature of trust. Come home, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. In the light from inside, he could see the lines around her eyes that he had stopped noticing sometime in the 3rd year of their marriage. The particular steadiness in her face that had once made him think she was simply good at managing her emotions, and now struck him as something entirely different. Not management, not suppression, but a settled authority in herself that had existed the whole time and that he had spent 5 years systematically failing to see. "No," she said. "Evelyn, I'm not saying no because I'm angry." She held the door. "I'm saying no because I'm not finished yet." She let the silence sit for a moment. "And because you don't yet understand what you're asking me to come back to." Roman said, "Then tell me what I'm asking." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Not softness, not warmth, but something more complicated than either. The look of a woman deciding how honest she can afford to be with someone who has not yet demonstrated that he can hold the weight of her honesty. "There's something you need to find first," she said, "before you come here with questions about us." She stepped back fractionally, still holding the door. "Go back to Chicago, Roman. Look at the communications logs the way I looked at them. Not for my name, for the other pattern." He went still. "What other pattern?" Her eyes held his. "You've been losing ground for 2 years and you thought it was external pressure. Rival families, market shifts, bad luck." A pause, and the next words came out with a quietness that was worse than any raised voice could have been. "It wasn't bad luck." The courtyard was very still. Behind her, the desk lamp threw its warm light across her papers. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog was barking at something. "Who?" Roman said. Evelyn looked at him for one more moment, and in that look was everything she had held for years, all the careful watching and the precise documentation and the loneliness of knowing something true that the one person who needed to hear it had never once created the conditions for her to say. And then she stepped back and closed the door, not with force but with finality. The soft click of the latch, the last sound before the silence closed over him like water. Roman stood in the courtyard with her words in his chest like a splinter too deep to reach. It wasn't bad luck. He turned and walked back through the gate to the rental car, and by the time he reached Chicago the following morning and pulled the full communications logs again. Not searching for her name this time, but for the other shape, the negative space, the pattern of what had gone wrong when no one was correcting it. He found, in the architecture of 3 years of quiet catastrophic sabotage, a signature he recognized. He had been looking at it for 40 years. He had called it loyalty. He found it on a Tuesday, not dramatically, not with the cinematic clarity of a single document that unlocks everything at once. It came in pieces, the way the worst truths always come, each piece ordinary enough on its own that you could convince yourself it meant nothing, until you had enough of them in your hands that the shape became undeniable, and you understood that the only reason you hadn't seen it before was that some part of you had been actively choosing not to look. Roman had been back in Chicago for 6 days. He had not slept more than 3 hours on any of them. The study had become something between a command center and a confessional. Every surface covered with communications logs, financial records, operational reports going back 30 months. He had pulled his 2 most analytically precise people off their current assignments and set them to work cross-referencing without telling them what they were looking for, because he needed their pattern recognition uncorrupted by his hypothesis. He gave them raw data and told them to find anomalies. He did not use the word sabotage. He did not use any word that would color what they found before they found it. On the 4th day, the younger of the 2, a woman named Priya, who had an accounting background and the specific kind of methodical patience that Roman had always valued above enthusiasm, set a single printed page on his desk without comment and stepped back. He looked at it. It was a timeline. 18 months of operational losses mapped against a secondary timeline of internal communications. The correlation was not perfect. It was never perfect, because the person constructing the sabotage had been careful, had varied the intervals, had layered legitimate losses alongside manufactured ones to create noise. But the shape was there. The negative space Evelyn had told him to find. Every significant operational failure in the past 30 months had been preceded by a window of between 4 and 11 days by a specific category of internal communication. Strategic planning documents routed through a particular approval chain. The approval chain had 6 nodes. 5 of those nodes were standard: department heads, senior lieutenants, people Roman had vetted personally. The 6th node was not standard. The 6th node was a coordination function that had been quietly inserted into the routing architecture approximately 32 months ago, designated in the system as an administrative oversight role, which was the kind of language that made it invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The sixth node had a name attached to it. The name was not Vincent Holloway's. It was a man named Gerald Marsh, whom Roman knew as one of Vincent's administrative staff, a background figure, the kind of person whose function is precisely to be unmemorable, who had been with the organization for 9 years, and whom Roman would have struggled to describe beyond the approximate facts of his age and height, and the corner desk he occupied on the third floor of the organization's primary building. Roman looked at the page for a long time. Then he said very quietly to Priya, "Where does this routing chain terminate?" She had anticipated the question. She set a second page beside the first. The routing chain terminated outside the organization. The documents, strategic planning materials, operational schedules, negotiation positions, had been forwarded at intervals to an encrypted external address. Priya had traced the address through 3 layers of proxy before hitting a wall she didn't have the access to breach. "I need the decryption," Roman said. "I know, that requires, I'll handle it." Sold. He called a contact he used for exactly this category of problem. A man in Seattle who asked no questions and expected payment in a specific cryptocurrency, and who had never once failed to breach what Roman needed breached. He had the external address cracked by the following morning. The decrypted files were delivered to his laptop in a compressed folder. Roman opened the folder at 5:47 in the morning, alone in the study, with the first gray light just beginning at the windows. He opened the first document and read the header, and then stopped reading and sat completely still for approximately 90 seconds. The external address belonged to a holding company called Meridian Strategic Consulting. Meridian Strategic Consulting had 3 registered principals. 2 of them were shell names. Roman recognized the pattern, had used similar constructions himself for legitimate purposes, and knew them when he saw them. The third principal was a real person, registered under his actual name, an arrangement that suggested either confidence or arrogance or both. The name was Vincent Holloway. Roman had known, on some level, since Evelyn's door had closed in Santa Fe. He had known in the way you know the answer to a question before you ask it, when the evidence has already assembled itself in your peripheral vision and all that remains is the formal act of looking directly at it. He had known, and he had spent 6 days confirming it with the kind of methodical precision that is sometimes indistinguishable from the need to delay the moment when knowing becomes undeniable. It was now undeniable. He closed the laptop. He sat in the study until 7 o'clock when he called Marcus. "I need Holloway here at 9, he said. "Tell him it's about the Galveston arrangement. He'll come." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Roman, do you want just him? And I want 2 of our people in the building, not in the room. Understood?" Understood. He spent the next 2 hours reading the full content of what Meridian Strategic Consulting had received. Every document in the folder, every forwarded planning report, every negotiation position paper, every operational schedule. He read them in sequence, with the pen he'd been using all week, and did not flag anything because flagging implied review, and he was done reviewing. He was now simply witnessing the complete record of what had been done to the organization he had spent 20 years building. 3 major contract failures that Roman had attributed to competitor intelligence, manufactured. Meridian had supplied the competing party with the Devereaux organization's exact position papers in advance of negotiation. 2 attempted alliance formations that had collapsed without explanation. Not bad timing, not cultural friction. The prospective partners had received communications, apparently from within the organization, implying Roman's instability and suggesting that alignment with Devereaux was a short-term liability. Both communications were documented in the files. The near collapse of the Vancouver transit arrangement, not an internal review as Cho's representative had claimed. A targeted letter sent on what appeared to be Devereaux organization letterhead, suggesting that the organization was under federal investigation. The letter was fabricated. It was also attached to the file, in its original form, with a draft notation in the metadata. The draft notation bore a timestamp. The timestamp predated by 4 days a conversation in which Vincent Holloway had sat across the same desk and told Roman, with every appearance of genuine concern, that the Vancouver arrangement was fragile and recommended caution. Roman set the last page down. He understood now the full shape of what Evelyn had spent a year documenting. She had found this, all of it, or enough of it to understand the architecture, and she had watched Roman dismiss her, sideline her, tell her to stay in her place in a crowded ballroom, and she had said nothing because she had known, with the precision of a woman who had spent 5 years studying him, exactly how he would respond if she brought it to him directly. He would have looked at his oldest advisor and his invisible wife, and he would have chosen the wrong one. The understanding of this did not arrive as anger. It arrived as something colder and more durable. A reckoning with his own architecture, the recognition that he had built the conditions for this betrayal himself, had maintained them for years, had been warned in ways he had not had the structure to receive. At 8:55, he heard Vincent's car on the gravel drive. Vincent came in looking as he always looked, composed, unhurried, the white hair, and the careful posture of a man who has made peace with the kind of life he has lived. He was wearing a dark coat and carrying nothing. He accepted the coffee that Roman's assistant offered and declined the chair he was gestured toward, preferring to stand near the window for a moment, as he sometimes did. Galveston, Vincent said. The lawyers have been pushing for a decision on the offshore structure by end of month. Sit down, Vincent. Something in the two words, not their volume, not their content, landed in the room differently than anything Roman had said to Vincent in 12 years. Vincent turned from the window. He looked at Roman. He sat down. Roman put the Meridian file on the desk and turned it so it faced Vincent and pushed it forward without speaking. Vincent looked at it. His face did not move. Not a flicker. Not a shift in the arrangement of his expression. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, and then he looked up at Roman. How long? Roman said. Roman? How long? Vincent looked at the file again, then back at Roman. The composure was still present. It was extraordinary, Roman thought, how complete the composure was. The face of a man who had rehearsed this moment or something close to it and had decided in advance what version of himself he would present when it arrived. 7 years, Vincent said. The number was larger than Roman had expected. He absorbed it without expression. You were my father's consigliere. Yes. 7 years means you were feeding them before my father died. Yes. Roman's hands were flat on the desk surface. He was aware of them in the specific way you become aware of your hands when you are concentrating on not doing what your body wants to do with them. Why? Vincent was quiet for a moment. Not constructing a lie. Roman was certain of that much, because he knew Vincent's lying register, and this was not it. He was deciding how much truth to offer, which was its own category of answer. Because your father was going to give the organization to your brother, Vincent said. Marcus Sr. He was the right man for it. He had the instincts, the patience, the relationships. You were talented, Roman, but you were 29 years old and you still believed that force was the answer to most problems. A pause. I had spent 15 years building what the organization had become by then. I wasn't prepared to watch it pass to a man who was going to run it on instinct and anger. My brother died in a car accident. Yes. The single syllable sat in the room with a weight that was different from all the syllables that had preceded it. Roman looked at Vincent's face and found it steady. The same composed, patient, carefully arranged face that had sat across from him in 100 meetings, had counseled him through 100 decisions, had been the voice in his ear for 20 years that he had trusted above almost every other voice in his life. Say what you're implying, Roman said. His voice was extremely quiet. I'm not implying anything. Marcus died in an accident. Vincent. A pause that lasted long enough that it functioned as its own kind of answer. I made decisions, Vincent said carefully, that I believed were necessary for the organization's survival. Some of those decisions were... He stopped. Some were not reversible. Roman stood up. He came around the desk slowly. He did not reach for anything. There was nothing in the room he needed to reach for, and Vincent knew this, and they both understood the grammar of what was happening. Roman stopped 3 feet from the older man and looked at him with an expression that was not rage, because rage had been burned through in the 2 hours between the laptop and this moment, and what remained on the other side of it was something quieter and more total. My brother, Roman said. Your brother was going to make decisions that would have... My brother. Vincent closed his mouth. You have been sitting across that desk, Roman said, for 12 years. You watched me build this organization. You watched me make decisions, wrong decisions, bad decisions, Decisions that cost people their lives and cost this organization money and relationships and ground. You watched me make every one of those decisions with your counsel in my ear. And the whole time, he stopped. Something moved through his jaw. The whole time you were feeding our strategy to a competitor. You were manufacturing failures. You were writing letters on our letterhead to destroy relationships that people I trusted had built. He paused. People my wife built. He paused. Vincent said nothing. She knew, Roman said. She had the file. She found it, and she put it together, and she brought it to you first, didn't she? Not a question. The shape of it had assembled itself in the last 5 seconds. She came to you. Vincent's expression shifted. The first genuine shift in the entire conversation. Something that was not quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man encountering his own history from an angle he hadn't fully considered. She came to me 14 months ago, Vincent said. She had partial documentation. She wanted to bring it to you. He paused. I told her she was misreading the data. You lied to her. I managed the situation. You lied to my wife and sent her away without the one thing she needed, which was for someone to tell her she was right. Roman's voice had reached the register that was below quiet, the register that his organization had learned over 20 years to treat as the final warning before something irreversible happened. And then she went back and kept building the file on her own for 14 more months. While you sat at my table and ate my food and gave me your counsel, Vincent held his gaze. The composure was cracking now, not visibly, not in any way that most people would have detected. But Roman had looked at this face across a desk for 12 years, and he could see it. The microfractures in the architecture of the older man's self-possession, the weight of the thing he had been carrying showing in the set of his eyes. I believed I was protecting the organization, Vincent said. You believed you were protecting your position in it, Roman said. There's a difference, and you have known that difference the entire time. He turned away from Vincent and walked back around the desk. He did not sit down. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, both hands pressed flat on the desk surface, looking at the Meridian file. There are 2 people outside this room, he said. They're going to come in now. You're going to give them access to every Meridian communication, every external account, every name of every person in that structure. You're going to do it completely, and you're going to do it today. A pause behind him. And if I don't? Vincent said. Roman turned around. He looked at Vincent for a long moment, at the white hair and the dark coat and the face of a man who had been the closest thing he had to a father figure after his actual father's death, who had shaped his thinking and his methods and his instincts for more than a decade, who had also, with the patient precision of someone who understood Roman well enough to know exactly where to place the knife, been dismantling everything Roman loved and trusted for 7 years. If you don't, Roman said, then I do this the way I would have done it 5 years ago. And that version ends differently for both of us. He held the older man's gaze. I'm asking you to give me the other option, not for your sake. He didn't complete the sentence. He didn't need to. Vincent had known Roman long enough to hear the end of it. Not for your sake. For mine. Because Roman was trying, for the first time in his adult life, to be the kind of man who chose the version that didn't require blood, and he needed Vincent to make that possible. Vincent looked at the file. He looked at Roman. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a phone on the desk. Everything is on there, he said. Every communication, every account, every name. Roman looked at the phone. He picked it up, he carried it to the door and handed it to Marcus, who had been outside with the steadiness of a man who has been in this organization long enough to know when to be exactly where he is told to be without needing to know why. Full extraction, Roman said quietly. Complete. Then hold him here. He went back into the study and closed the door. He stood alone in the room for a moment. Then he sat down in his chair, not at the desk, but the chair by the window. The chair he never sat in, that had been in this room since the renovation 3 years ago, and that he had never used because he didn't have the habit of sitting near windows. He sat in it now and looked out at the November yard, the bare trees, the gray sky pressing down on Chicago with the specific weight of a season that had no patience left. He thought about his brother. He did not allow himself to go far with that thought, because going far with it would take him somewhere he could not afford to go tonight, with the phone in his hand and the organization in crisis and every decision he made in the next 72 hours determining whether what he had spent 20 years building would survive the week. He held the thought at the surface, his brother's face, the specific quality of his laugh, the car accident that had cleared the succession path and delivered Roman to a position he had not been ready for and had spent 20 years trying to prove he deserved. He held it there, and then he set it down. He called Priya. "I need the full meridian exposure mapped. Every operation that was compromised, every relationship that was damaged, every third party that received material from that routing chain. I need it in a format I can present to the affected parties directly." A pause. "How long?" 48 hours if we run it overnight." "Run it overnight." He ended the call and sat with the phone in his lap and the bare November trees outside and thought about Evelyn in Santa Fe, at her desk with her papers spread around her, and her cardigan and her loose hair, looking like someone who had already begun to build the next version of her life in the ruins of the one he hadn't seen. She had known. She had known for over a year, had documented it, had assembled a case that would have, if Roman had been the man she had originally believed him to be when she married him, ended this cleanly and without the additional damage of the past 14 months during which Vincent had continued operating while Evelyn's evidence sat buried. She had brought it to the wrong person first. She had brought it to the wrong person because she had not been able to bring it to Roman. Not because she doubted her evidence, not because she was afraid, but because she had spent 5 years watching him choose the wrong thing when she was the one offering the alternative. And she had calculated, with the accuracy of a woman who had studied him more carefully than he had ever studied her, that he would choose wrong again. She had been right. The certainty of this was one of the worst things he had felt in 20 years of feeling very little. Worse than the betrayal itself. Worse than the knowledge about his brother, which sat at the bottom of everything like a stone he would have to eventually pick up and examine, and he was not ready for that yet. The worst part was that she had been right. He had made himself the kind of man whose wife couldn't bring him the truth. He had done that himself, one decision at a time, one dismissal at a time, one stay in your place at a time, and the consequence of it was not just the damage to his organization or even the damage to his marriage. The consequence was that for 14 months, while Evelyn sat alone with evidence of a 7-year conspiracy and a 14-month-old lie, and the growing understanding that the person closest to Roman was also the person destroying him, she had been alone with all of it because there was nowhere safe to bring it. He had made himself unsafe for the truth. He picked up his phone again and looked at her number. He did not call. Not because he didn't want to, but because he finally, for the first time in possibly his entire adult life, understood that what he wanted was not the same as what she needed, and that collapsing that difference was the entire problem, and that the only way forward was to fix what he had broken before he asked her to trust the wreckage. He had the Meridian file. He had the phone. He had 48 hours before Priya's exposure map was complete. He had, in the room down the hall, his consigliere of 12 years sitting with 2 of his men in the particular silence of a man who has run out of moves. He had, outside the window, the gray weight of a Chicago November that did not care what he did next. He had a brother who had died in a car accident 7 years ago, and a question he had not yet asked Vincent directly, and the knowledge that when he asked it, he would not be able to unask it, and that the answer would either confirm the last shape of the thing or open a dimension of it that would require a kind of response Roman had never made before in his life. Not a response built on force or leverage or domination, but something he didn't yet have a word for. Something Evelyn had been practicing for years in the quiet margins of his empire while he looked in the other direction. He stood up from the window chair. He went back to the desk. He sat down, pulled the Meridian file toward him, and opened it to the first page again. And this time he began reading not to understand what had happened, but to understand what it would cost to make it right. Not just for the organization, not just for the families that had been damaged, but for the specific irreversible damage done to the woman who had spent years standing in the gap between his failures and the consequences of them, and who had left not because she gave up, but because she finally chose herself, which was the most devastating and most correct thing anyone had ever done to him. He read until 3 in the morning. When he finally stopped, the house was completely silent and the file was completely known to him, and he understood with the total clarity of a man who has just seen the full map of where he is that the next step was not a negotiation, not a power move, not a demonstration of leverage. The next step was the one thing Roman Devereaux had never, in 43 years, found a reason to make himself do first. He was going to have to tell the truth. Not to an adversary, not in a room full of witnesses, not with force behind it to make the truth safe. He was going to have to tell it in the open, to people who had been damaged, with nothing to offer but the accurate record of what had happened and the acknowledgement that he had been responsible for the conditions that made it possible. And then, if he did that correctly, he was going to have to walk back into a courtyard in Santa Fe and ask Evelyn Ashcombe not to come home, not to forgive him, not to return to what they had been, but to stand in a room full of the most dangerous men in the country and do the things she had been doing in the shadows for years, this time in the light. While Roman Devereaux stood behind her and learned what it meant to support someone instead of simply expecting them to hold everything up alone. He did not know yet if she would say yes. He knew, for the first time, that whether she said yes or no, she would be right. The exposure map took 41 hours instead of 48. Priya delivered it at 11 in the morning on a Thursday, sliding the folder onto the desk with the careful, controlled movement of someone who has spent the night looking at something that disturbed them and has decided that the professional thing is to present it without editorializing. Roman looked at her face before he looked at the folder. She was 29 years old, and she had worked for this organization for 4 years, and she had, in those 4 years, seen things that would have unmade a less constitutionally steady person. Her face right now had something in it that Roman had not seen there before. How bad, he said. 17 confirmed compromises, she said. 11 relationships with material damage. 4 of those are potentially unrecoverable without direct intervention. She paused. And there are names in the Meridian communications that go beyond the organization's direct partners. Politicians. 3. 1 federal, 2 state. All with documented material they received from Meridian that influenced decisions affecting Devereaux operations. She paused again. There's also a name from the Okoye family's inner circle, someone who was receiving Meridian communications independently of the family leadership. Roman absorbed this. Margaret Okoye doesn't know. Based on the communication pattern, no. The contact was lateral, someone inside her organization who was being paid for intelligence. It appears to have been running for approximately 14 months. 14 months, the same window as everything else. The same window during which Vincent had told Evelyn she was misreading the data and sent her away to keep building her case alone. He closed the folder. I need the room for 20 minutes, he said. Priya left. Roman sat alone with the folder and the November light coming through the window and the specific quality of silence that fills a space where a decision is about to be made that cannot be unmade. He had been in this kind of silence before, had made decisions in it that he had justified as necessary, as strategic, as the price of maintaining the kind of organization that operated in the spaces between law and legitimacy. He had made those decisions quickly, because hesitation in his world was its own category of weakness. He sat with this one for the full 20 minutes. Then he picked up the phone and called Margaret Okoye. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been expecting him, which meant her instincts were already ahead of the information. He respected this about her. Mr. Devereaux, she said. I need to meet with you in person, Roman said. You and Philippe Delacroix and James Cho, in the same room, within the next 72 hours. A silence that lasted exactly long enough to tell him she understood the gravity of it. That's a significant request. I know what it is. I'm asking you to trust me enough to come. A pause. I'm also calling to tell you that someone inside your organization has been receiving payments from a source connected to a 7-year operation that has been working against all of our interests simultaneously. I'm not calling to accuse you. I'm calling because you deserve to know before you walk into the room. Another silence, longer. Who? She said. He gave her the name from the Meridian file. He heard her breathing change, a small controlled adjustment, the sound of a woman absorbing a piece of information and immediately beginning to process its implications without allowing the processing to be audible. I'll be there, she said. The call ended. He called Philippe Delacroix next, and then James Cho, and delivered the same essential information to each with the same directness. No positioning, no leverage framing, no performance of strength, just the facts as he had them, and a request that they come. Both said yes. Both said it with the particular quality of men who were recalibrating something in real time. The meeting was set for Saturday evening. Chicago. The Aldermere Grand because Roman had decided that the location mattered, that the room where Evelyn had removed her ring and walked out needed to be the room where whatever came next began. He had one more call to make before Saturday. He drove to O'Hare and booked the next available flight to Albuquerque. She opened the gate before he reached it. He had not called ahead this time either, but the rental car was the same model. And she had, he understood now, the kind of awareness that registers variables other people miss. She was standing in the courtyard when he came through the gate, her arms crossed over her cardigan, her expression not surprised and not welcoming, simply watchful, the way she always was, the way he had once categorized as reserve and now understood as precision. "You found it," she said. "All of it." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her face, not satisfaction, not vindication, closer to the expression of someone who had been hoping to be wrong. "Vincent?" she said. "Yes." "How long?" 7 years. She closed her eyes for approximately 3 seconds. When she opened them, they were steady. "Your brother?" she said. Not a question. Roman's chest tightened in a way that he did not allow to reach his face. "I asked him directly. He said the accident was an accident." He paused. "I don't know if I believe him." Evelyn held his gaze. She didn't offer comfort, and she didn't offer distance. She held the space between them with the specific quality of presence that he had spent 5 years not recognizing for what it was. Not passivity, not deference. Witness. She had always been witnessing him, accurately and without distortion, and he had spent 5 years mistaking that for absence. "Come inside," she said. It was the first time she had said it. He followed her into the small house and sat across from her at the desk she had converted into a work table, surrounded by papers that he could see were connected to the conflict mediation work she had been building here. Correspondence, organizational documents, what looked like a structural proposal for a formal institute. She had been working. She had been working since the day she left. "There's a meeting Saturday night," he said. "Delacroix, Okoye Cho." All three in the same room. He held her eyes. "Every negotiation that's been sitting in collapse since you left, and before you left, the relationships that Meridian damaged, the trust that was pulled out from under all of them without their knowledge. I have the documentation. I have the full exposure map." He paused. "I need someone who can walk into that room and do what I cannot do." Evelyn looked at him. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I'm asking you to come to Chicago on Saturday night as an independent mediator, because without you, that room ends in a way that hurts people who don't deserve to be hurt by what Vincent built." He stopped. "And because you're the only person alive who can stop it." She was quiet for a long moment. "If I come," she said, "I come as myself, not as your wife, not as a representative of your organization, as Evelyn Ashcombe. Yes, I set the terms of the mediation. You don't direct it, you don't interrupt it, and if I ask you to leave the room, you leave." "Yes." Another silence. She looked at the papers on her desk, at the organizational documents, the structural proposal, the work she had built in 6 weeks in a small adobe house in Santa Fe with no one's permission and no one's resources but her own. "I'll come," she said. "For them, not for you." He nodded. "I know the difference." He left an hour later without touching his coffee. Saturday arrived with the particular weight of days that have been anticipated with dread. Roman was at the Aldermere Grand by 4 in the afternoon, overseeing the setup of the private dining room where the meeting would be held. Not the ballroom, a smaller room on the second floor, round table, no head position, everything arranged with the deliberate equality of a space designed for conversation rather than hierarchy. He had removed the Devereaux organization's standard security protocol and replaced it with a neutral arrangement, 2 people at the door, unarmed, there to manage access and nothing else. Marcus arrived at 4:30 and stood near the window looking at the setup with an expression that took Roman a moment to identify. "What?" Roman said. "Nothing." Marcus paused. "It looks different." "It is different." Marcus nodded slowly. He had been with the organization since he was 26, and he had the accumulated wariness of someone who has watched powerful men make decisions for 9 years and has learned to read the decisions before they fully form. Tonight, his face had something in it that was not quite hope and not quite fear but inhabited the uncomfortable space between them. Vincent's people have been quiet, Marcus said. No unusual communication since Thursday. He knows the exposure is complete. There's nothing left to manage. Roman straightened a chair that didn't need straightening. His entire network was built on information advantage. Once the information is public, the network collapses. And him. Him I handle after tonight. Tonight is about the families. Roman looked at the round table. Everything else waits. The guests began arriving at 6:30. Philippe Delacroix came first with one associate he introduced as his operations director and then positioned near the door as clearly as a man can position someone without saying the word bodyguard. He was 64, heavy-set, with the particular physical authority of a man who had grown up doing physical work before he grew up to run the people who did it. He shook Roman's hand with a grip that communicated assessment rather than warmth, and sat down without removing his coat for several minutes. James Cho arrived 10 minutes later. He was younger than Roman had expected from voice alone. Early 50s, slim, with the contained and calibrated presence of someone who had grown up in rooms where the wrong expression at the wrong moment had consequences. He sat across from Delacroix, and they acknowledged each other with the specific economy of men who know each other's capabilities and have reasons to respect them. Margaret Okoye came last, at 7 exactly, and she came alone, which told Roman something about the kind of woman she was, that she had considered the security calculation and decided that the statement made by arriving alone was worth more than the protection of a second body in the room. She was 57, elegant in a way that was entirely functional rather than decorative, and she looked at Roman when she entered with the kind of direct assessment that does not require preamble. "The person I named," she said quietly, before sitting down. "Handled," Roman said. She looked at him for a moment to verify that the word meant what she needed it to mean. And then she sat down. The room held the particular tension of 4 people who operate in a world where the wrong word has historically meant the wrong outcome. All of them sitting with the knowledge that something has been done to them collectively, and none of them yet knowing the full scope of it. Roman remained standing near the door. He had not taken a seat at the table and did not intend to. At 7:05, Evelyn came in. She was wearing dark gray, a structured jacket, tailored trousers, her hair pulled back with the clean severity that was her working register. She carried a leather folder and nothing else. She did not look at Roman when she entered. She looked at the table and the 4 people around it, and she set her folder down at the one remaining seat, positioned neither at the head of the table, because there was no head, nor in any particular alignment with any of the existing groupings. And she stood behind the chair for a moment without sitting. "My name is Evelyn Ashcombe," she said. "I'm here as an independent conflict mediator. I have no organizational affiliation with any party in this room. I've been provided with documentation relevant to the matters we'll be discussing tonight, and my role is to facilitate an honest exchange of that information and to help identify a path forward that serves everyone's interests." She paused. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about one thing. Nothing said in this room tonight will be weaponized by anyone. If that condition cannot be accepted, now is the time to say so." Silence. Philippe Delacroix said, "Accepted." James Cho nodded. Margaret Okoye said, "Proceed." Evelyn sat down and opened the folder. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not the kind of scene Roman had spent 20 years operating in. There was no leverage deployed, no position held, no demonstration of force or financial consequence. Evelyn walked each party through the meridian exposure with the precision of a woman who has spent weeks understanding every layer of it, not presenting Roman's version of events, but the documented record itself, the communications, the timelines, the evidence of what each party had lost and how it had been manufactured. She named the damage without drama. She named it accurately. Roman stood near the door and watched. He watched Philippe Delacroix's jaw tighten when he understood the full scope of the Baton Rouge corridor manipulation, not just what had been taken from him, but how it had been done, with the specific information about his organization that could only have come from inside the Devereaux operation. He watched Delacroix look at Roman across the room with an expression that contained a significant quantity of anger, and underneath the anger, the particular relief of a man who has suspected something for years and has just been given the confirmation. He watched James Cho go very still when the Vancouver letter was presented. The fabricated federal investigation letter, the metadata timestamp, the proof that the internal review that had nearly ended their transit arrangement had been a manufactured crisis. Cho's stillness was different from Delacroix's anger. It was the stillness of a man recalculating, reordering a sequence of events he thought he understood, and finding that almost none of it had happened the way he believed. He watched Margaret Okoye listen to all of it with the focused, contained attention of a woman who had already processed the betrayal within her own organization and had arrived tonight having done the emotional work of it in advance, which left her free to be present for the larger picture rather than reactive to it. Twice, Evelyn paused and looked at Margaret, and Margaret gave a small nod that said, "Continue, I'm with you." Roman had never been in a room where power moved the way it moved in this room. It didn't move through force or threat or the particular gravity of accumulated leverage. It moved through information honestly held and honestly shared, and through the specific authority of a woman who had no stake in any outcome except the right one. At 7:55, Philippe Delacroix put both hands flat on the table. "The Meridian network," he said. "Is it fully dismantled?" "The communication infrastructure is down," Roman said from the door. "The financial accounts have been frozen. Every name in the network has been identified." He paused. "Vincent Holloway is being held pending a decision about how to proceed with the full exposure." "He should be exposed," Cho said. His voice was flat and cold. "Fully. Every family he touched." "I agree," Roman said. "That's what I intend to do." "Through what channel?" Margaret Okoye said. "Through the network he used to damage us," Roman said. "I'm proposing that every affected party receive the complete Meridian documentation simultaneously, not filtered through me, not filtered through any single organization. The full record to everyone it concerns at the same time. No information advantage for anyone." He paused, "including myself." The room absorbed this. It was, Roman understood, the single most operationally costly thing he had ever proposed. The Meridian documentation contained information about his own organization's strategies, his own failures, his own exposure. Releasing it simultaneously to every affected party meant releasing it without the ability to control how it was received or used. It meant giving up the only remaining leverage he had. It also meant that the story of what Meridian had done could not be shaped by any single party. It meant the truth landed everywhere at once, and everyone could see it in the same light. He had not discussed this with anyone before tonight. He had not told Marcus. He had not told Evelyn. He had walked into this room with it as the only thing he had to offer that was actually worth anything. Evelyn looked at him from across the table. Her expression was not surprise. It was the look of someone recalibrating a calculation they had been running for a long time, adjusting a variable that had changed. "That's a significant offer," she said. Her voice was neutral. "It's the correct one," Roman said. Delacroix looked at Cho. Cho looked at Okoye. The three of them conducted the kind of rapid, silent communication that belongs to people who have been in high-stakes rooms together long enough to have developed a shared shorthand. "If the documentation goes out simultaneously," Delacroix said slowly, "and every affected party has the same information at the same time, the destabilization risk is significant. A dozen organizations receiving evidence of years of manipulation at once could trigger exactly the kind of chain reaction Vincent was presumably trying to engineer." "Yes," Roman said. "So the release can't happen without a framework," Evelyn said. She had her pen in her hand and she was making a note in the folder. "Something that accompanies the documentation. A proposed structure for how the affected parties navigate the information together rather than in opposition." She looked up. "A peace framework." The room was very quiet. "That's been done before," Margaret Okoye said carefully. "In my experience, it has rarely held." "It hasn't held," Evelyn said, "because it's been built on the assumption that power is the stabilizing force. Everyone agrees to peace because they fear what happens if they don't." She looked around the table. "What I'm proposing is built on something different, a shared interest in accurate information, ongoing, mutual, not controlled by any single organization. A structure where what happened with Meridian cannot happen again because the information channels are open by design rather than manipulated by a single actor." She paused. What I'm describing is something none of your organizations have tried before, which is trust. The word landed in the room with the specific weight of an idea that is both obvious and radical simultaneously. Delacroix made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You're asking a room full of people who have operated on the assumption that trust is a liability to build an agreement on the premise that it's an asset. Yes, Evelyn said. Why would we? Because the alternative is what you've been living with for 7 years without knowing it, Evelyn said. Her voice was level. A system where someone else's deception defines your decisions, your losses, and your relationships. Where you think you're operating on intelligence and you're actually operating on manipulation. She let that sit for a moment. The alternative to trust isn't independence. It's vulnerability to whoever is willing to exploit the vacuum. Delacroix looked at her for a long moment. You built 3 alliances in this room's organizations, he said. Informally, without authority or compensation. A pause. Why? Because the violence that would have happened if those alliances collapsed would have hurt people who had nothing to do with any of this, Evelyn said. People who don't get to vote on whether the organizations above them go to war. The room was quiet again. Roman from the door watched Philippe Delacroix's face move through something. Not softening exactly, but the kind of reorientation that happens when a man encounters a motive he doesn't have a category for and has to build the category in real time. What does the framework look like? Cho said. Evelyn opened the folder to a second section. She had come prepared. For the next 90 minutes, she walked them through it. Not a treaty in the traditional sense, not a power-sharing arrangement or a territory agreement, or any of the structures that Roman's world typically used to formalize the cessation of conflict. It was something different. An information protocol. A shared channel. A set of agreed principles for how disputes between the affected organizations would be surfaced and addressed before they became crises, with Evelyn's Mediation Institute as the neutral architecture that made the channel possible. She had been building this in Santa Fe. The papers on her desk that Roman had seen through the window, the organizational documents, the structural proposal. This was what they were for. Not an abstract institute for former criminals and business leaders, as Roman had understood it. This specific structure, for this specific room, built in advance of this specific night, because she had known, had calculated, with the accuracy she brought to everything, that this meeting would eventually happen and that it would need something to land on that wasn't another version of the same power arrangement that had produced Meridian in the first place. She had been building the answer before Roman had finished finding the problem. At 9:47, James Cho said, "I'd sign this." At 9:51, Margaret Okoye said, "So would I." Philippe Delacroix looked at the document for a long moment. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Roman, near the door, who had not spoken in 90 minutes and had not needed to. "Who holds the chair?" Delacroix said. "In this institute. Who runs the channel?" "I do," Evelyn said. "Independently. Not in affiliation with any organization in this room." Delacroix looked at Roman again. "And you're comfortable with that arrangement?" "It only works if she's independent," Roman said. "That's the point." Delacroix looked back at Evelyn. Something in his face had settled. The anger had not disappeared, but it had been reorganized, filed into the category of history rather than the category of present threat, which is the specific reorganization that makes agreements possible. "All right," he said. "I'll sign it." The pen moved around the table. Roman watched from the door as 3 people he had spent years managing through leverage and force signed a document that Evelyn had built in 6 weeks in a house in Santa Fe, and in the signing of it created something that had not existed before in any of their worlds. Not a treaty, not a negotiated peace, but the architecture of something that might, if it held, become the actual alternative to the cycle of manufactured conflict and managed violence that Meridian had exploited for 7 years. The room began to decompress slowly. Handshakes, genuine ones, or the closest approximation available to people in this room. Margaret Okoye crossed to Evelyn and said something quiet that Roman couldn't hear, and Evelyn nodded, and something in the nod told him that Margaret had said something that mattered. Delacroix stopped near Roman on his way out. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at Roman with the measuring quality he'd had all evening. "You let her run the room," he said. "She ran the room better than I would have." Delacroix looked at him a moment longer. Yes, he said. She did. He put his coat on. 7 years is a long time to miss something that was standing right in front of you. He left. Roman stood near the door as the room emptied, until only Evelyn remained, gathering the papers from the table, placing them back in the folder with the methodical care of someone who understands the value of what they've just created. The room was very quiet now. The pen marks on the document were dry. The chairs were pushed back at various angles, evidence of the specific geometry of a conversation that had been real. She closed the folder. She looked up and found him still there, near the door, in the same position he had held for nearly 3 hours. You prepared that framework before tonight, he said. Before you called me, she said. He absorbed this. You knew the meeting would happen. I knew something would have to happen, she said. And I knew when it did, whoever was in the room would need something to sign that wasn't just another arrangement built on fear. She picked up the folder. So I built it. The ballroom was somewhere below them in the building, empty tonight. The same chandeliers throwing the same fractured light onto the same arrangement of chairs that nobody was sitting in. Roman was aware of the building around them, the specific weight of a place where things had happened that could not be undone, where a ring had been set on a linen tablecloth and a woman had walked out and an empire had begun to understand for the first time what it was actually made of. The Devereaux organization is done, Roman said. I'm dissolving it. The legitimate components, security, logistics, I'm restructuring as a legal corporation. The rest I'm dismantling. He held her eyes. I'm doing it regardless of everything else. I want you to know that. Evelyn looked at him. I know, she said quietly. I know you are. The way she said it, not as validation, not as surprise, but as the simple recognition of something she had seen coming and had not known whether it would arrive in time, landed in his chest like a key turning in a lock he had not known was there. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. The framework needs a launch event, she said. Something public, formal. All 3 families, your organization, the institute, together, in front of people who matter, in a way that makes the structure real and visible and hard to unwind. She looked at him. In about 3 months, when the restructuring is stable enough to hold. Here, Roman said, this building. Here, she agreed. She walked toward the door. He stepped aside. She stopped in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and turned back. Not with softness, not with any of the things he had been hoping for and had not been owed, but with the look of a woman who has decided to tell the truth one more time in a room that has tonight proven capable of holding it. You did something tonight that I didn't know if you were capable of, she said. You stood in the back of a room and let someone else lead it. You gave up every piece of leverage you had left. She held his eyes. That's not the man I married, Roman. That's someone I don't know yet. A pause. I need time to decide if I want to. She left. Roman stood in the empty room with the signed document on the table and the chairs at their various angles and the November night pressing against the windows. His phone rang. It was Marcus. He answered. It's Vincent, Marcus said. His voice was wrong. The specific quality of wrong that Roman had learned over 9 years meant that the information being delivered was not the information anyone had planned for. What happened? He's gone. The building, the men you had on him. There was a window of about 12 minutes during the meeting when the secondary shift changed over. He walked out. A pause. Roman. He wasn't alone. Someone helped him out, someone who knew the shift schedule. The room was very quiet. Someone inside, Roman said. Someone inside, Marcus confirmed. Roman looked at the signed document on the table, at the framework that Evelyn had built and the 3 signatures that had made it real and the architecture of the thing that was supposed to begin to repair what Meridian had spent 7 years breaking. He looked at it and understood that the man who had built Meridian had just been freed by a person Roman had not yet identified, which meant the network was not dismantled, which meant the next move was already in motion, which meant that everything that had been accomplished tonight was real and also fragile, in a way that Roman had 12 minutes to figure out how to protect. He was already moving toward the door when Marcus said the second thing. The second thing Marcus said was a name. Priya, Marcus said. It was Priya. Roman stopped walking. He stood in the corridor outside the second-floor meeting room with his phone against his ear and the building quiet around him. and processed what Marcus had just said with the specific stillness of a man whose pattern recognition has just caught up to something it should have caught 2 days earlier. Priya, 29 years old, 4 years with the organization, the woman who had delivered the exposure map, who had worked overnight to produce the Meridian timeline, who had sat across from him and described the damage with the controlled affect of someone who found the material disturbing, who had also, in producing that exposure map, known exactly which 12-minute window in which building's shift rotation would create the opening Vincent needed. "Where is she?" Roman said. "Gone. Her apartment is clean. Not packed, just clean. Like she knew she wouldn't be going back." "She built the exit into the map," Roman said. Not angry, just reconstructing. "She gave us the information and used the process of giving it to us to engineer the window." "That's what it looks like." Roman looked at the wall in front of him. Plain plaster, cream-colored, a sconce that threw insufficient light. He had 12 minutes of lead time. 12 minutes that were now closer to 8, because the conversation with Marcus had taken 4. Vincent Holloway was somewhere in Chicago with a woman who had been inside Roman's most sensitive review process for the past 6 days, which meant Vincent now had the complete exposure map, the full documentation, every name and account and communication that Roman had been planning to release simultaneously to the affected parties in order to dismantle the Meridian network permanently. He had the weapon Roman had built to destroy him. "Pull everything," Roman said. "Every copy of the exposure map, every transmitted file, every communication channel Priya had access to over the last 6 days. I want to know what she touched and what she could have transmitted." "Already running. And I need Vincent's known properties, not the registered ones, the ones we know about because we've been in this business long enough to know where people keep things they don't want found." He was already moving back down the corridor. "I need them in the next 3 minutes." "Roman," Marcus paused. "If he releases that documentation before we can—" "I know. Everything you just built tonight?" "I know, Marcus." His voice was quiet. 3 minutes. He went back into the meeting room. Evelyn was gone. She had left while he was on the phone, and the room held the residue of the evening. The chairs at their various angles, the signed document still on the table, the folder she had taken with her closed and gone. He crossed to the table and picked up the document. 3 signatures. The framework. The thing she had spent 6 weeks building in Santa Fe in the forward-thinking way she did everything. He folded it carefully and put it in his inside jacket pocket. Then he went downstairs. Marcus met him in the lobby with a printed page and a look that said the 3 minutes had been close but sufficient. Roman scanned the page while walking. Vincent had 3 properties in the Chicago area under various arrangements. 1 registered, 2 known through the organization's institutional memory of a man who had spent 40 years learning where to keep things he didn't want found. The second of the 2 known properties was a warehouse space in Bridgeport, a neighborhood south of downtown where the organization had done business in the early years and where Vincent had maintained a quiet foothold that Roman had known about and never examined because Vincent's private arrangements were not Roman's concern. They had been Vincent's concern. Roman took 2 people from the building's security arrangement, not his own full team because assembling a full team took time he didn't have, and drove south on Lakeshore Drive with Marcus, the city moving past the windows with its indifferent amber light, the lake invisible to the east behind the buildings but present in the quality of the air, that wet cold that Chicago wore in November like a second skin. They were 12 minutes out when Roman's phone rang again, not Marcus. The number was Margaret Okoye's. He answered. "He called Philippe," she said, without preamble. 20 minutes ago, Vincent Holloway called Philippe Delacroix directly. He has a version of the exposure documentation. He's telling Philippe that the framework Evelyn presented tonight was built to benefit your restructuring at the expense of the other families, that the Mediation Institute is a cover for continued Devereaux influence. "It isn't." "I know it isn't," Margaret said. "But Philippe is a man who has been manipulated for 7 years, and he has not had as much time as I have to decide where his trust is going to land." A pause. "He's not signing off on the framework tonight. He's putting it on hold pending review." Roman looked at the city moving past the window. 1 signature gone. The framework required unanimity. Evelyn had built it that way because a structure that could hold under pressure needed to be entered without reservation, or not at all. One withdrawal pulled the whole thing. "Is he reachable?" Roman said. "He turned his phone off after calling me." "Where's he staying tonight?" She gave him a hotel name. He noted it. "Margaret," he said, "don't let him leave Chicago before I talk to him." "I'll try." A pause. "Roman, whatever you're doing right now, do it quickly." He ended the call. Marcus looked at him from the driver's seat. Roman did not explain. Marcus had been with him long enough to know when explanation was not the priority. They reached Bridgeport at 11:47. The warehouse was a 2-story brick building on a commercial block that had been in slow industrial decline for 20 years. The kind of neighborhood where a light on after midnight was unremarkable because the definition of remarkable had long since adjusted downward. There were 2 cars in the rear lot. One Roman recognized as a vehicle from the organization's secondary fleet, which meant Priya had either taken it or directed Vincent to it, which meant the connection between them ran deeper and longer than the last 6 days. Roman went in through the loading dock entrance with Marcus and left the other 2 men on the exterior. The dock door was unlocked, which was either carelessness or invitation, and Roman treated it as both simultaneously, moving through the space with the physical awareness that 20 years in rooms where carelessness and intention were sometimes the same thing had built into his body, tracking the geometry of the space, the positions of exits, the quality of the silence. The ground floor was empty. Storage, old furniture, obsolete office equipment, the accumulated residue of a space that had been used for holding things without being used for anything specific in a long time. A staircase at the far end, light from the second floor, visible at the top of the stairs as a thin line under a door. Roman went up. He opened the door. Vincent was sitting at a table near the room's single window, a laptop open in front of him, a glass of water at his right hand. He was still wearing the dark coat from earlier in the evening, though it was open now. He looked up when Roman came through the door with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had decided, somewhere between the warehouse and now, that expectation was its own form of preparation. Priya was not in the room. "She's gone," Vincent said, reading Roman's scan of the space. "She did what she was asked to do. I sent her on." He gestured at the chair across the table. "Sit down, Roman." Roman did not sit down. He looked at the laptop. "You called Delacroix." "I did." "What did you send him?" "A portion of the exposure documentation. Enough to raise questions about the framework." Vincent folded his hands on the table in front of him with the composed deliberateness that was his oldest and most reliable tool. "I sent him the parts that show the financial infrastructure of the proposed Mediation Institute aligns with several of the Devereaux organization's current restructuring accounts. Because you engineered that alignment," Roman said. "You had 6 days of access through Priya to the restructuring documents. You built the overlap." Vincent looked at him for a moment. "Yes." The word landed with the flat finality of a man who has stopped managing and started confessing, which was its own kind of danger. A man with nothing left to manage was a man operating without the restraint that self-interest usually provided. "You're going to send me to prison," Vincent said. "The full exposure goes out. My name is on the Meridian structure. The financial record shows 7 years of documented sabotage. I have perhaps 2 options at this point." He paused. "One of them involves that laptop and what's currently loaded on it." Roman looked at the laptop. "What's on it?" "The complete exposure documentation modified, restructured to implicate the Devereaux organization in the Meridian operation as co-architect rather than victim." Vincent's voice was very even. "It would take me approximately 40 minutes to complete the modification and distribute it. By morning, you're restructuring your legitimate corporation, everything you're trying to build. It would be buried under a federal investigation that would take years to resolve." He let that sit. Or, Roman said, "you let me walk. You absorb the Meridian losses as the cost of doing business. You don't release the documentation publicly, and the framework collapses quietly. Felipe pulls out, the other 2 follow eventually, and everything goes back to the arrangement we've had. The organization continues. I stay out of sight. Nobody goes to prison." He unfolded his hands. "You've spent 20 years building something. I'm offering you the option that lets you keep it." Marcus was behind Roman and to the left. Roman was aware of him the way he was always aware of the people in a room, without having to look, by the quality of the silence they occupied. He was also aware of the distance between himself and the table, and the distance between the table and the window, and the weight of the signed framework document in his inside jacket pocket. He thought about Philippe Delacroix in a hotel room with his phone off, sitting with a modified document that had been designed to produce exactly the kind of doubt that would pull him out of the agreement. He thought about Evelyn driving back to Santa Fe in the morning if the framework collapsed tonight, going back to the small adobe house and the desk with the papers spread across it, and building the next version of the thing that Vincent would find a way to corrupt, because that was what Vincent did. Found the architecture of trust, and inserted himself into the gap between what people believed and what was true. He thought about his brother. "Tell me about Marcus Sr., Roman said. Vincent's expression did not change. "I've told you. It was an accident." "You told me it was an accident," Roman said. "That's not the same thing." He came forward one step. 7 years, Vincent. You've been in my house. You've sat at my table. You've watched me build this thing. You've watched me make decisions about people, about what they were worth, about whose counsel I trusted. You've watched me do all of that in a world where you knew, from the beginning, what the ground I was standing on actually was. He stopped. "Tell me what happened to my brother." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, Chicago murmured its continuous ambient presence. Traffic, distant sirens, the low hum of a city that never fully silenced. Vincent looked at Roman for a long moment. In that moment, Roman could see, for the first time, the thing that had been underneath the composure the entire time. Not guilt in the operational sense, not remorse in any simple form, but the particular weight that accumulates in a person who has made a decision that cannot be unmade and has spent decades carrying it without being able to set it down. "Your brother was going to audit the organization's financial structure," Vincent said. He had already spoken to an outside accountant. He had found inconsistencies in the accounts that I had been managing for 3 years at that point. He paused. If he completed the audit, everything I had built would have been visible. Everything. A beat. The car's brake system was tampered with. It was done by a man who has since died of unrelated causes. There is no evidence remaining. Roman did not move. He was 27 years old, Roman said. Yes. He had a daughter. She was 3 months old when he died. Vincent said nothing. The silence in the room had changed quality. It was heavier now, denser, the kind of silence that accumulates around something that has been said for the first time and cannot be unsaid. Roman stood in it. He felt it in his chest and in his hands and in the back of his throat, and he held it there because losing the hold on it would produce an outcome that he had already decided. Somewhere between the second floor of the Aldermere Grand and the loading dock of this building was not the outcome he was going to allow himself. He had spent 20 years being the version of himself that made decisions based on force. That version of himself knew exactly what to do in this room right now. That version was still present, still alive in his hands and his jaw and the specific tension in his body that was not grief and not rage, but the combination of the two that he had spent his entire adult life calling resolve. He was choosing not to be that version, not because Vincent deserved the alternative, not because justice could be served by anything clean, but because the choice he made in this room right now was the choice that would define whether everything that had happened tonight, the framework, the signatures, the thing Evelyn had built, and the thing Roman was trying to build in its direction, meant anything at all, or whether it was just another layer of the same story he had been living for 20 years. "Close the laptop," Roman said. Vincent looked at him. "Close it." Vincent closed the laptop. "Marcus?" Roman said. Marcus came forward. He took the laptop from the table with the care of someone handling evidence, which was what it was. He took the glass of water and set it on the floor out of reach, which was a precaution, which told Roman that Marcus had been reading the room correctly the whole time. "You're going to write a full confession," Roman said to Vincent, "not to me, to every party that Meridian damaged, including what you just told me about my brother. Complete, in your own words, with every name and account and decision." He held the older man's eyes. "And then it goes to the appropriate federal authority, because I am done being the person who decides what justice looks like in this organization." He stopped. "You wanted me to keep this inside, keep it manageable, keep it the way it's always been. That's over." Vincent looked at him. "You understand what a federal investigation does to your restructuring." I understand what it does, Roman said. I'm doing it anyway. Something moved through Vincent's face. Not surprise, because Vincent Holloway was not a man who was easily surprised. Something more complicated. The look of a man who has spent 40 years knowing someone and has just encountered a version of them he hadn't accounted for. All right, Vincent said, very quietly, like a man setting something down. Roman called Felipe Delacroix from the car at 12:43 in the morning. The phone rang 7 times before Philippe picked up, which meant he had been awake and deciding whether to answer. I need 20 minutes, Roman said. In person, tonight. A long pause. It's 1 in the morning. I know. I'm 10 minutes from your hotel. He paused. Philippe, the document Vincent sent you was modified. I can show you the original alongside the version he sent. 20 minutes. The pause this time was different, shorter, with a different quality to it. Lobby, Philippe said. 20 minutes. Roman had Marcus drop him at the hotel entrance and told him to go home, which was not a thing he had ever said to Marcus at 1 in the morning during an active situation. And the fact that Marcus accepted it without argument told Roman something about the distance they had both traveled in the past 3 weeks. Philippe was in the lobby, still in his coat, looking like a man who had not removed it since the evening because he had been preparing to leave rather than to stay. He looked at Roman when Roman came through the revolving door with the expression of a man running a final assessment. They sat in the far corner of the empty lobby bar. Roman put the original exposure document on the table. He put the modified version, pulled from the laptop Marcus had taken from the warehouse, before the device went to the appropriate chain of custody. Beside it. He did not explain. He pointed to the specific alterations. The account numbers that had been shifted, the timestamps that had been adjusted, the single addition to the organizational chart that placed Devereaux as a co-principal in the Meridian structure. Philippe looked at both documents for a long time. He was a careful reader. Roman could see his eyes moving line by line, comparing, returning to specific passages, the methodical assessment of a man who had built his operation on not being fooled. The modification metadata, Felipe said finally, shows a timestamp of 11:58 tonight, Roman said. The original document was completed Thursday morning. The meeting was Saturday. He had the window. He paused. He used Priya, one of my analysts. She's been compromised for at least the duration of the review process, possibly longer. Felipe looked at the 2 documents side by side for another long moment. And Holloway is in federal custody as of 2 hours from now, Roman said. The confession is being written. Full disclosure, everything, including my brother. He said the last 2 words evenly, without the quality of performance, because he had made the decision, and the decision was clean, and the only way to carry it was with both hands. Philippe looked at him then, really looked at him, the way he had not quite done all evening, with the specific attention of a man who has been in this world long enough to recognize when something genuine is happening in front of him. Your brother, Philippe said slowly. He was killed by Vincent 7 years ago, to protect the Meridian operation before it had a name. Roman held the older man's gaze. It's in the confession. Philippe sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at Roman. And you're still... He stopped, restarted. You're still choosing the framework after all of that. I'm choosing it because of all of that, Roman said. Because my brother is dead and I spent 7 years not knowing why, and Vincent was at my table the whole time, and the only reason I found out was because my wife built the case he would have buried. He paused. I'm not interested in being the kind of organization that produces another Vincent. That means I have to be a different kind of organization. The framework is how I start. Philippe looked at the 2 documents on the table. At the modification and the original, the evidence of what had been attempted and what was actually true, sitting side by side in the empty lobby of a Chicago hotel at 1:30 in the morning. He picked up the original. I'll call my lawyer in the morning, he said. The signature stands. The federal disclosure took 3 weeks. Roman's attorney coordinated the submission, the complete Meridian documentation, Vincent's written confession, the financial records, the communication logs, all of it delivered in the organized and comprehensive format of a man who had made a decision and intended it to be final. The federal process was not clean, and it was not quick. and it produced exactly the turbulence for the restructuring that Vincent had predicted. Investigations, account holds, a period of several months during which the transition from the Devereaux organization to Devereaux Security and Logistics Corporation existed in legal suspension, neither fully formed nor fully dismantled. Roman worked through it. He worked through it with the same methodical precision he had brought to everything in his life, and also with something new: the willingness to accept counsel from people he would previously have considered sources of information rather than partners in decision. He spoke to Philippe Delacroix twice a month. He had 2 conversations with Margaret Okoye that lasted over an hour each, and that he came away from thinking more clearly about the restructuring than he had before he called. He hired an operations director from outside the organization's existing personnel, a woman in her 40s who had restructured 2 other security firms and who looked at Roman's existing structure and told him plainly what had to go and what could be rebuilt. And Roman listened to her in the way that he had not, for most of his adult life, been capable of listening to people who told him things he didn't want to hear. He did not contact Evelyn during this period, not because he had given up, but because he understood, with a clarity that the last 3 months had ground into him, that the kind of change he was attempting could not be demonstrated through contact. It could only be demonstrated through time and through the specific texture of the decisions he made in her absence. She would not believe words. She had been given his words for 5 years. What she might eventually believe was the record. He built the record. The annual gala of Devereaux Security and Logistics fell on the same weekend as the previous year's anniversary banquet, which was not coincidence. Roman had scheduled it deliberately because he had a specific relationship with this date now and intended to change what it meant. The venue was the Aldermere Grand. Same building, different room. The ballroom, because the ballroom was where it had started, and Roman did not believe in avoiding the places where things had happened. He believed in returning to them differently. The guest list was smaller than the previous year and more deliberately composed. The legitimate business community that the new corporation was entering, legal counsel, the principals of the framework's participating organizations, and several journalists who covered conflict resolution and corporate restructuring, whom Evelyn's Institute had developed relationships with over the past months. Evelyn had not confirmed attendance until 4 days before the event. Her confirmation came through her institute's administrative contact in the form of a single professional email addressed to Devereaux Security and Logistics Events Coordinator, stating that the Ashcombe Conflict Resolution Institute would be present to discuss the framework's first-year progress with interested parties. The email was signed by her. It was entirely professional. It contained no personal communication of any kind. Roman read it twice and then set it on his desk and went back to work. He arrived at the Aldermere Grand 2 hours before the event and stood in the empty ballroom in his coat, looking at the room as it was being set up around him. He was thinking about the last time he had stood in this room when it was full of people, and about a woman in ivory who had walked through it and out of it and had left something small in white gold on a linen tablecloth. He reached into his jacket pocket. The ring was still there. It had been in that pocket, transferred from jacket to jacket over the past year, because he had not been able to put it away and had not felt he had the right to do anything else with it. It sat in his palm now, same ring, same weight, and he looked at it for a moment and then closed his fingers around it and let it be what it was. Not a symbol, not a promise, not a claim on anything, just an object that had once meant something and might. If the record he had been building was sufficient, mean something again in a different form, he put it back in his pocket. The room filled. Roman did not take the stage that had been prepared for him. He had told the event coordinator 3 weeks earlier that there would be no formal remarks from the Devereaux side of the evening, that the evening's principal speaker would be introduced by him, and that he would be brief. The coordinator had asked 3 clarifying questions, all of which Roman had answered, and the coordinator had adjusted accordingly. Evelyn arrived at 7:15. She came through the main doors, the same doors she had walked out of a year ago, wearing something darker this time, a deep charcoal that was almost black, her hair loose in the way it had been in Santa Fe, which told him something he didn't allow himself to read too deeply. She was accompanied by a woman from her institute staff, to whom she said something as they entered that made the woman nod and move toward the registration table while Evelyn continued into the room. She found him. She always found him. She crossed the room without hurrying and stopped 2 feet from him, and they looked at each other in the noise and light of a room full of people the way they had looked at each other a year ago in a room full of people. But the geometry was different now. There was no table between them, no staged position, no performance being managed for an audience. They were simply 2 people in a room that had been the site of a catastrophic decision, standing in it a year later with the weight of everything that had happened since. "You look well," she said. "So do you." A pause. Her eyes moved across the room. The composition of the guest list, the absence of the usual security infrastructure, the round tables instead of the hierarchical seating of the previous year. She was taking inventory the way she always took inventory, building the complete picture before she responded to any part of it. "You changed the seating," she said. "No head of table," Roman said. "Marcus found a structural argument against it. I found it convincing." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, the territory adjacent to one. "The restructuring is stable," she said. It was not a question. "Stable enough. 3 more months before the legal process closes completely." He paused. "The framework's first-year numbers are good. Your institute's report is in the materials tonight." "I know." She looked at him. "You didn't have to center the evening around it." "It's what the evening is about," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment. In the year since Santa Fe, he had tried to imagine what she was building toward and had stopped because he didn't have the information and he didn't want to construct a version of her in his mind that might be wrong. He had let the record speak and waited. "Roman," she said. "Yes." "Your niece." She said it quietly, so that only he could hear it in the ambient noise of the room. "Your brother's daughter. She's 12 now." He had been in contact with her mother, tentatively, carefully, in the way of someone who understands that proximity to the truth of a thing is complicated for everyone it touches. He had not told Evelyn this. He had not told anyone except Marcus. "I know," he said. "Her mother reached out to me," Evelyn said, 2 months ago. She heard about the framework, about the institute. She wanted to know—" She paused. She wanted to know if the confession was real, if what it said about Marcus Sr. was documented and solid. "It's documented," Roman said, "completely. She wants to meet with you." Evelyn held his eyes. "I told her I would ask." The room moved around them, the evening proceeding in all its ambient complexity, the conversations and the clinking of glasses, and the particular sound of a room full of people who are learning to be in the same space differently. Roman stood in the middle of it with this information settling into him. His niece, his brother's daughter, now 12 years old, her mother asking for the meeting that the truth had finally made possible. "I'll meet with her," he said, "whenever she's ready." Evelyn nodded. The evening's program began a few minutes later. Roman took the microphone briefly by 5 sentences, which was the number he had decided on and rehearsed, and was not going to exceed. He said that the evening honored the first year of a structure that had been built by someone whose work he had failed to see for 5 years and had spent the last year trying to understand. He said that the organization bearing his name had been built on force and was being rebuilt on something that required considerably more courage than force. He said that the Ashcombe Conflict Resolution Institute represented a model for what it looked like when intelligence was applied to peace rather than to the maintenance of power. He said her name. He stepped back from the microphone. Evelyn took the stage. She spoke for 40 minutes, and Roman stood near the back wall and listened to her the way he had not, in 5 years of marriage, ever truly listened to her. Not for information, not for the parts that affected him, not with the filtering intelligence of a man assessing relevance. He listened to her the way you listen to something you are trying to understand from the beginning, as if for the first time, setting aside everything you thought you already knew. She was extraordinary. He had known this, had known it in the abstract, in the evidence, in the testimony of Philippe Delacroix and Margaret Okoye and every person who had described her work over the past year. But knowing it from evidence and experiencing it in the same room were different things. And standing at the back of the Aldermere Grand Ballroom, watching Evelyn Ashcombe speak to a room full of people who were listening with the quality of attention that is the only true measure of a speaker's authority, Roman understood something that no evidence could have given him. He had not failed to see her. He had seen her and looked away because what she was had been inconvenient to what he was, and he had chosen the convenience of not looking rather than the difficulty of seeing something that would require him to change. That was the thing he had to carry. Not Vincent's betrayal, not the years of manufactured loss, not even his brother. Though his brother was the weight that would never fully lift. The thing he had to carry was the specific willingness with which he had looked away from the person who was standing right in front of him. He carried it. The evening ended slowly. Conversations extended into the later hours, the room thinning by degrees, the event coordinator moving through with the professional efficiency of someone concluding a successful evening. Margaret Okoye stopped near Roman on her way out and said, without preamble, "She's better at this every time I see her," and left before he could respond. Near midnight, the room had emptied to the last few guests, and the cleanup crews beginning their quiet work at the edges. Roman found Evelyn near the windows at the far end of the ballroom, looking out at the Chicago night. The same view she had had a year ago from a different angle. The city's amber grid against the dark sky, the invisible lake somewhere beyond. He stopped a few feet from her. She turned. They were, for the first time in the evening, genuinely alone. "The framework proposal for the second year," she said. "It includes an expansion to 3 additional organizations. The Institute will need a permanent office in Chicago." "I know," he said. "I saw the proposal." "You read it?" "I read everything the Institute publishes." He paused. "I have since September." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a lot of reading." "It's good work." She looked out the window again briefly, then back. There was something in her expression that was neither the professional composure of the evening nor the contained guardedness of their previous encounters over the past year. Something that had come to the surface in the quiet of the nearly empty room, more textured than either. The look of someone who has been holding a question for a long time and has not yet decided if they're ready to ask it. Roman reached into his jacket pocket. He did not take the ring out. He kept his hand closed around it and looked at Evelyn and said the thing he had been building toward for a year, not in the form of a request and not in the form of a declaration, but in the form of the most honest sentence he had available. "I don't want to go back to what we were, Mom," he said. "I don't think what we were was good enough for either of us. I think I was insufficient in ways I'm still finding, and I think you spent years doing work that deserved to be visible and wasn't. And I think neither of those things can be undone." He paused. "But I've spent a year building something different, and I want to keep building it, and I would rather do that with you than without you. Not because you're owed it, because I want to be the person who stands next to you, and not the person you have to compensate for." The ballroom was very quiet. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. She had the absolute stillness she always had when she was doing her most careful thinking. No performance, no signal, just the genuine quality of a person deciding something real. "If we do this," she said, "there are conditions." "Tell me." "The Institute operates independently, completely. My work is mine. Yes. You ask before you decide on anything that touches both our lives, not inform. Ask." "Yes. And if you ever—" She paused, not with emotion, but with the precision of someone choosing words for accuracy rather than impact. "If I ever walk into a room and feel like I'm supposed to stay in my place, we're done. Permanently. No negotiation." "I know," he said. "I know that." She held his gaze for one more long moment. Then she extended her right hand. He looked at it. He understood. She was not asking for the ring, not asking for the past, not asking for any of the architecture of what they had been. She was asking for something to begin with, something equal, something that didn't require her to disappear into it. He opened his left hand, looked at the ring briefly, and then closed his fingers around it again and put it back in his pocket. He extended his right hand and took hers. Her grip was firm. His matched it. "Side by side," she said. "Side by side," he said. Outside the windows, Chicago continued its patient amber hum. Indifferent as always, large as always, the lake cold and invisible to the east. The cleanup crew moved through the far end of the ballroom with their quiet efficiency, restoring the space to its neutral state. And in the ballroom's remaining light, Roman Devereaux and Evelyn Ashcombe stood at the window with their hands joined, not in the posture of reconciliation or forgiveness or triumph, but in the specific posture of two people who have survived the worst of each other and the worst of themselves, and have chosen, with clear eyes and no illusions, to begin, not again, for the first time,